Welcome to the Union Jews podcast. The UK's only all things union show. Carefully curated for your digital downloadable listening pleasure. Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Union Jews podcast, the UK's only all things union show. I'm Simon Sapper, and today we're talking about strikes and minimum service levels. Now, all of us in the union world, and plenty more who aren't, will be aware of the Strikes and Minimum Service Levels Act. If the argument over the concept, then the bill, and now the Act seems to have been running forever, that's because of two reasons. First, this is indeed a long-running saga, which is still continuing. And second, there is a sharp, really sharp ideological divide between government, whose legislation this is, and unions, many employers, human rights and civil liberty advocates. The point of this special episode is to act as a toolkit, if you like, a reminder of why we are in this situation, a refresher on the inconsistencies and inaccuracies in the government's position, and a primer on just why the reality of trying to put the Act into practice exposes the government's approach as disproportionate, non-consensual, and dangerously ill-conceived. Helping me and us understand all this is Richard Arthur, Head of Trade Union Law at Thompson Solicitors. But are we in something of a hopeless position? The government, having steamrolled the legislation through Parliament, is now moving on to the implementation phase in transport, education, border security and health. Ioannis Katsaroumpas of Sussex University argues that the Act crosses the Rubicon, moving us from neoliberalism, which is bad enough, to an authoritarian approach to labour relations driven by a government that has the power to act, but no consent for what it does. I asked Richard if he felt that Katsaroumpas was right.
I think there's some truth in that. A line has been crossed here. This, to my mind, is the culmination of over a decade of attacks on trade union rights. And I think this minimum service levels is the most important. It's really about stopping working people having their voices heard. And it's really about a government that's intent on stopping people protesting against them. And if you can't solve the problem of pay in the workplace and you can't get to agreement with your workers, what's this government going to do? It's going to try and legislate against them. But that's what this is.
But as the government moves to introduce the codes of practice that will give life to the Act, and despite some minor modifications to them, the codes remain deeply problematic. Here's Richard again.
The underlying principle of this code of practice is still wrong. It's still profoundly wrong. It pits unions against their own members. It means that unions are going to be required to police, in effect, the minimum service.
To get a more detailed picture of the fundamental fatal flaws in the minimum service levels legislation, I think it's worth taking a closer look at the Commons Transport Select Committee and their report into the implementation of minimum service levels legislation in their sector. In September of this year, 2023, the committee published its report on how minimum service levels would work in practice in the rail industry. They set government 9 tests that they, the committee, thought that government should adopt in order to assess whether or not minimum service levels were effective. First of all, the committee said that a minimum service level provided on strike days should be at least as good as typically provided on previous strike days. Second, safety on the network for staff and travelling public must be the primary consideration. Third, the minimum service level must be flexible enough to be applied to different patterns of industrial action affecting different employers. Fourth, regulations should affect the differential impacts of staff operating rail services on strike days. A greater responsibility placed on those who must work on strike days to provide a minimum service must be reflected in pay and conditions. Resilience in staffing must be improved so that there are trained alternatives able to cover for specialised staff who may want to exercise their right to strike. Fifth, The minimum service level must be specified in a way which enables knowledge about travelling patterns in particular regions and localities, including access to employment, education and essential services to be taken into account. 6. Rail services or credible alternatives should be available to passengers in all areas of the country normally served by the network. 7th, passengers with access needs must receive the same support as they are entitled to on regular travel days. 8th, a minimum service level for rail should protect industries, such as the nighttime economy, that cannot adopt flexible and remote working patterns on strike days. And 9th, and finally, there must be clarity about the access that freight services can expect to have to the network, and government and the freight industry must collaborate on determining what routes should be prioritised. I recognise that was a bit of a list, but I thought it was worth stating it in full because it raises 3 things that are immediately apparent. First, basically what the committee is saying is you should pay people more because they lose their right to strike. Now, given the right to strike is a fundamental human right, I don't think you can really put a price on that. Second, the scope of those rail workers at risk of having their right to strike cancelled could be very, very wide indeed. I mean, the government may say, for example, that their intention is for 40% of services to run on strike days. But if you think about safety issues, that may lead to, say, 100% of signalling or maintenance staff being directed to attend for duty. Now, that's not a restriction, that's a prohibition. And third, there's a whole load of things in that list that really should be business as usual in any properly run industrial sector or employing organisation, not just brought in to cope with the eventuality of strike action when you have minimum service level legislation. But the committee didn't stop there with those 9 questions. Oh, no. They said to government that this is what you need to satisfy yourselves after any strike action that included minimum service level provisions, if you're going to say that the minimum service level provisions worked. So, first, industrial disputes were neither prolonged or increased. Novel industrial action didn't proliferate. Second, passenger satisfaction on strike days is greater than at present, and passengers have access to clearly commuted information in relation to service operation and greater certainty further in advance than at present about travel on strike days. And third, long term, there is more effective cooperation and better working relationships between rail unions, the industry and government. I think we'd all say hallelujah to that, wouldn't we? It does sound like the committee knows something that government ought to take careful note of. It also sounds like minimum service levels may give a better service on strike days than normal arrangements. So, we have a step into authoritarianism and at best a messy, contradictory implementation plan. But this approach hasn't come from nowhere. There is a clear ideological trend. But the Minimum Service Levels Act surpasses even the loathed 2016 Trade Union Act. Here's Richard.
After the 2016 Act, if you got the more complicated notification requirements right, if you got the required thresholds, you could still call for and organise the industrial action that the workforce called for. But here, and what we've got now, is your industrial action is going to be curtailed by the minimum service levels. And we know in rail transport, because we've already seen the regulations which have been laid, that means that 40% of train operating services are going to be allowed to run. Now that is an enormous and the biggest yet incursion onto the right to strike.
Now, the government is fond of pointing to other European countries and saying, look, they have minimum service levels in France, Germany and whatever, and they work fine. Richard reminds us that this is not actually comparing like with like.
It is such a disingenuous comparison for the government to make with the situations in France, in Spain and in Italy and in other countries. And the reasons for it is this. What you have to do is you have to look at the totality of the restrictions which are placed on the right to strike. Now, in each of those 3 countries, the ones that the government cites time and time again, there is a constitutionally protected right to strike. In none of those countries do you have the complicated notification and balloting requirements that you have in this country. When was the last time you heard of a ballot being called in a public sector strike in France? You haven't, because there's no requirement to do so. In all of those countries, there are also significant protections for workers that are taking part in industrial action. This is the industrial landscape of the legal mechanisms in those countries. The situation is entirely different here, where you have over a decade now, and years before that, of restriction after restriction after restriction being heaped on unions. Really, the situation in the UK with minimum service levels is more closely akin to Russia than it is to other countries.
And yet the government still parrots the "it's fine in France" line. Underpinning all this, in my view, is that the Minimum Service Levels Act is one of those periodic ideological chasms in UK labour relations. Look back through history. 6 agricultural workers at Tolpuddle were transported to Australia for founding a union in 1834. The Rail Workers' Union at Taff Vale in 1900 were met with a court ruling that removed immunity for lawful strike action. The Pentonville Five, shop stewards who were jailed in 1972 for breaking a National Industrial Relations Court injunction. 1984, trade unionists at GCHQ in Cheltenham were told to quit their union or lose their job. All these workers and their unions have been shown to be on the right side of history. But in 2023, are the barriers to strike action in minimum service level sectors so high and so thick that there is precious little room for optimism? Richard Arthur thinks not.
I think the first thing is, how workable are these minimum service levels going to be? Because, for example, in border security, the standard is providing an efficient service in non-passport services. Now, what does that mean? What is the level of an efficient service? In the context of rail transport, what exactly does it mean for a train operating company to provide up to 40% of the normal operating services? I strongly suspect that any sensible employer is going to look at these minimum service levels and think, actually, we're better off talking to the union. We're better off coming to a voluntary arrangement exactly like we did before, exactly like the unions were prepared to do before. So I think the first question is going to be, how much are these actually going to be used in practice? The question then becomes, if they are used, will the unions find a way to scale this yet most recent obstacle? I have absolutely every confidence that they will do so, and that suitable strategies will be found and will be deployed, and we're already advising on what some of those are.
And that is what is starting to happen. The TUC has a special Congress this weekend. A senior official there reiterated to me that Congress will not rest until the minimum service level legislation is repealed. The Labour Party is equally clear, and we know an election is coming. In Scotland, the SNP administration has reiterated that they will not support work notices issued under the Act. So, the writing is on the wall for this Act and for this government. But 2 things are clear. First, this whole saga shows the folly of believing that you can legislate your way out of an industrial relations crisis. It only makes matters worse. And second, we can take absolutely nothing for granted. This is Simon Sapper saying thanks for listening. Solidarity, and see you next time. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Union Jews podcast. Music by Scott Holmes, a Makes You Think production.